Chapter 7 Reckoning. By midnight, it was pitch black. There was no moon, and the only light was a yellow glow from a motorway that ran behind the 10-metre-high walls on one side of the training compound. Dana, James, and Jake had night vision goggles fitted onto special clasps built into their helmets. The goggles didn't work in complete darkness. Instead, they amplified light, turning the world into a strange mixture of blackness, punctuated by intense green outlines. The imaging software inside the goggles took a fraction of a second to process what it saw. This tiny lag between making movements and your eyes registering them made James queasy. When they clambered from their hideout, they were hoping to ambush the building where Dana and Jake had spotted Team A 40 minutes earlier, but they'd moved on. Their only legacy was an empty equipment box and a stinking puddle where a couple of boys had peed in the corner. "What now?" Jake whispered, as a stun grenade erupted somewhere in the distance, turning the view through his goggles into a white sheet. James was disappointed, but he still had faith in his night vision strategy. "We keep hunting," he said. They began a cautious trek through the compound, moving slowly, keeping low, and speaking only when absolutely necessary. If they got caught in a wide open space, they could easily get picked off, so they stuck to side streets and alleyways, only venturing into the main avenues when they had to cross them. James noticed a green outline inside a building as he passed a window, but he didn't say a word until they reached the end of the street and ducked between two houses. "2 buildings back," James whispered. "There's at least one person moving inside." Dana was her usual contemptuous self. "Are you sure it's not a stray cat or something?" James shook his head. "Too big. Definitely human. I'll take it from the front. Dana, you climb over the garden wall and cut around the back. Wait until you hear me make my move and be ready to cut them off if they try to escape. Jake, you wait here. Set your rifle to automatic and be ready to cover us if things get heavy." "Yes, sir," Jake said. Dana shushed him. "Shh, less noise, you little idiot." James turned slowly on his heel and crept back to the building where he'd spotted the movement. He leaned in front of the window and cautiously poked his head up above the ledge, moving very slowly because he didn't want the ammunition clips inside his pack to jangle. His night vision goggles showed the outlines of 2 bodies sitting against a wall. They were a little smaller than James, and, although it was hard to tell from his artificially intensified view, he got the impression that they were both female. Realizing there was a chance it could be Lauren and Bethany, James ducked down and made the signal. "Meow?" He knew he'd blunted the element of surprise, but James didn't want to end up in a shooting match with his own teammates. The 2 figures inside scrambled for their weapons as one of them replied hurriedly, "Meow." As soon as James heard the wrong signal, he jumped up above the window ledge and fired a shot. One girl screamed out, and James ducked again as the other fired blindly into the darkness. When this firing stopped, James popped up and fired 2 more accurate shots through the window, hitting the other girl both times. Meanwhile, Dana had entered via the back door of the building. She ran along a short corridor and burst into the room. James would have liked more time to use the advantage of his night vision to psych the girls out, but he had to make his move once Dana was in the room. "I want your eggs and the driving springs from your rifles," James announced as he jumped through the window. "Up yours, James," Kerry answered. James and Dana ducked out of the way as wild shots flew around the room. Then Kerry's gun made a hollow click. "Oh dear," James gloated. "That sound isn't good." "I've got more," Kerry said. "So why are you sitting still instead of reloading?" James asked. "Can you see us?" Kerry asked. Every move you make," James laughed. "We've got night vision." Gabriel sounded furious. "Jammy little..." "Oh, hi, Gabriel," James said, as he clambered through the window. "I didn't realize it was you. I hope that hit's not stinging too badly." I bet it's not as bad as when I shot you in the back earlier on, Gabrielle snarled. James, Dana said fiercely, from the opposite side of the room. We just made a giant racket. Cut the cute banter and let's get out of here. Kerry laughed. Oh, it's Dana. I thought there had to be someone with brains behind this operation. Yeah, James, Gabrielle agreed. I saw how you looked out for your team by running off at 90 miles an hour. James was irked. I've got my gun pointing right at you, he said angrily. Shut your stupid holes, throw us your packs, and hand over your guns. Why don't you come over and get them? Kerry jeered. James fired a warning shot into the wall a few centimeters above Kerry's head. Because this clip is stuffed with ammunition. I can see every move you make and I can shoot you at will. Now, I'm going to count to 3, and if your guns and packs haven't landed somewhere near my feet when I finish, you two are going to feel serious pain. 1, 2... Kerry and Gabrielle's pride didn't extend far enough to run the risk of another hit. They surrendered their stuff before James finished counting. He crouched down and grabbed the egg box out of Kerry's pack. It was hard to see in the darkness and tricky to feel through the protective gloves, but so far as James could tell, Kerry's eggs were all intact. 6 unbroken eggs for Little Miss Perfect, James giggled as he ground up the eggs under his boot. This isn't over, Kerry shouted back defiantly. You have to let us go, and I'm going to hunt you down. I reckon this makes us even, James answered. Remember last summer at the hostel, when you two blasted me and Bruce with the paintball guns from point-blank range? A small voice piped up from outside before Kerry got a chance to respond. There's 4 people heading our way from the top of the street, Jake said. Let's get out of here before World War III breaks out. I've crushed Gabrielle's eggs, Dana said. Let's roll. James realised he didn't have time to take the driving spring out of Kerry's gun in pitch darkness, and it was too awkward to take it with him, so he swung it by the barrel and smashed it as hard as he could against the wall. As he spun back, Kerry lunged at him. Dana fired a shot, but she'd aimed cautiously to avoid hitting James and ended up missing both of them. Kerry crashed into James. She was smaller and lighter than her boyfriend, but her martial arts skills were far in advance, and 5 years of CHERUB training had made her stronger than a 13-year-old girl had any right to be. As James smashed into the ground with Kerry on top of him, a stun grenade exploded inside a building a few doors up the road. Before Kerry pinned James, he found a second to shout out at Dana. Take Jake and get out of here! James's logic was simple. Eggs were what counted in the final tally. He only had 1, while Jake still had 6 unbroken ones. Rather than get caught up in the melee that seemed set to break out, it was better to run off, even if that left James to tangle with the girls on his own. As Kerry pinned James's shoulders under her knees and Gabrielle ripped away his gun, Dana escaped out of the front window and ran off with Jake. Kerry thumped James's helmet against the concrete floor, demolishing the night vision goggles. Shots were being fired in the street outside as the broken goggles over James's visor plunged him into absolute darkness. Thought you were pretty clever, didn't you? Kerry said sweetly. Remember combat class, James? How many times did I tell you? Never turn away from your target and never let your guard down for a single second. Gabrielle crunched James's single remaining egg as Kerry pulled his arm tight behind his back. Want a broken shoulder, James? Kerry, James gasped. Please, you got my eggs. You've got to let me go now. Why don't you write a letter to the United Nations? Kerry grinned as she released his arm and smashed the point of her elbow into his lower back. As James whimpered in pain, Gabrielle sounded happy. He's got tons of ammo in this backpack. Great, Kerry said, as she grabbed Gabrielle's gun off the floor and loaded a clip. Let's head out the back way and try catching up with those other 2. James lay face down on the bare concrete. Kerry had elbowed him in the same spot where he'd been shot, and the pain in his lower back was terrible. As Gabrielle exited, she made James suffer the ultimate indignity, shooting him twice in the thigh with his own gun. James woke from a weird dream, with a string of drool dribbling down the inside of his visor and the taste of smoke in his mouth. The sun was up, though at first he could only see cracks breaking around the edges of the broken night vision goggles still fitted to his helmet. He got a sharp reminder of Kerry's elbow in the back the instant he tried to move. He rolled cautiously onto his side and tried to prise the goggles off, but the plastic clip holding them in place had cracked when Kerry knocked them against the floor, and now they refused to separate from the helmet. James twisted the goggles, but eventually he had to resort to brute force, showering the room in plastic fragments as they snapped away from the helmet. Once his eyes adjusted to the daylight, James raised the cuff of his padded suit and looked at his watch. It was 6:15, meaning he'd been unconscious for about 4 hours, and the exercise still had more than 2 hours to run. James couldn't remember clearly, but he realised the mixture of pain and exhaustion must have made him pass out. Nobody voluntarily nods off in the middle of training when they're tanked up on adrenaline and their heart is banging out 180 beats a minute. With no clue about the safety of his immediate environment, James crawled over the concrete floor towards the nearest wall and sat against it, pausing briefly to study the multitude of coloured splats where he'd been shot. He felt slightly lightheaded and desperately thirsty, but his canteen had been in the backpack with the ammo that Kerry had taken. He peered cautiously out of the window, studying the residue of the previous night's battle. It was easy to tell the difference between fresh paint splats and older marks that had been smoothed out by rain. James thought about searching for the other members of his team, but he'd run the risk of getting shot, and without a gun or ammunition, he didn't think he'd be much use anyway. He decided the best strategy was to stay where he was, counting out the minutes until the exercise ended and hoping that no one would stumble into him. He glanced at his watch again as his mind fixed on the cold drink he hoped to get hold of in 132 minutes. Chapter 8. Deliverance. The last hours of the exercise contained nothing like the full-blown battles of the evening before. James suspected that most teams had run low on equipment. Ammunition, working rifles, and eggs were in short supply. Most importantly, so was the energy required to fight. Only the sounds of occasional light skirmishes disrupted the morning birdsong. To pass the time, James messed with Kerry's rifle. Although he'd smashed it against the wall and knocked a lump out of the wooden stock, it only took a light clean and a few adjustments with the attached multi-tool to get the firing mechanism running. The trouble was, he still didn't have any ammunition. He stretched and massaged the tender area of his back and took a pee in the hallway outside, but after an hour, boredom got the better of him, and he decided to explore. He started off checking out the rest of the house. He found a couple of discarded ammo clips. Occasionally, people will drop a clip with a few shots left and replace it with a full one if they're heading into action. But all he found were empties. The back of the building had a small garden, and James crept outdoors with the intention of jumping over the waist-height wall into the next one. But as he raised his leg, he came over lightheaded, and for a moment thought he was going to be sick. He lay out on the grass and raised his visor a couple of centimetres to breathe some fresh air. James was slightly worried. By CHERUB standards, this wasn't a particularly tough training exercise, but he felt weak. A half hour before 8 a.m, he recognised Lauren and Bethany cutting along the alleyway behind the garden wall. They were the first figures he'd seen in more than an hour, so he decided it was safe to expose his position with a meow. Woof, Lauren replied. James was happy to see them, despite the humiliation of having no eggs or ammo, while the girls' confident air suggested that they were doing okay. As they clambered over the wall, James made a rough count of the splats on their uniforms and realised they'd each taken 6 or 7 hits, about the same as him. "What's up with you?" Lauren asked. "You're all stooped." "I was tired before we even started. Then I got a killer shot in the back and Kerry thumped me in the same spot with her elbow. It's agony." Bethany laughed. Lover's tiff. James ignored the jab. I lost my canteen, he said. Have either of you got any water left? Lauren nodded as she pulled her pack off her shoulder and handed James a metal canteen with a long plastic straw on top. We found a standpipe inside one of the houses and topped our bottles up. James grabbed the canteen, fed the straw up through the base of his helmet, and began to gulp. Don't drink it all, greedy guts, Lauren gasped, snatching her canteen back. So, have you got any eggs left? James asked. Lauren nodded. I've got 2. Bethany's got 4. You? James shook his head. Have you seen Dana and Jake? We met up with them at about 4 a.m, Lauren said. They reckon Kerry and Gabriel were after them. Were they getting on okay? James asked. Dana seemed her usual surly self, Bethany said, shaking her head. But I actually got the impression that my psychotic little brother had started to enjoy himself. James nodded. It might be fun if it was paintball or laser tag, but this simulated ammunition is too damn painful. I guess that's the whole point of the exercise, Lauren said. We're supposed to be learning how to act when we're tired and under lots of stress, not having some jolly shoot-up. James nodded. I just hope we don't get that 10-kilometre run for finishing last. Mind you, I'm whinging under this suit, so I could probably live with the cold shower. As soon as the siren went off, James, Lauren and Bethany ripped off their visors and took in giant gasps of fresh air. As they headed towards the square in the middle of the compound where they'd been instructed to meet at the end of the exercise, the 3 of them unzipped their overalls and pulled their hands through their sleeves, leaving the thickly padded arms dangling down behind their legs. James was feeling slightly better, and 40 minutes of chatting with the girls had helped refocus his mind away from his aches and pains, but they'd run out of drinking water. Bethany scratched beneath a sweaty grey CHERUB t-shirt stuck to her belly as she walked. God, I'm thirsty, she gasped. Tell me about it, James said, as he pulled his t-shirt over his head. You should be all right, Lauren huffed. You drank most of mine. The morning sun felt nice on James's bare back as the t-shirt weighed heavy in his hands like a wet flannel. You know what? He said exuberantly. I'm so thirsty I could drink my own sweat. He held the t-shirt in the air over his head, poked out his tongue, and gave it a squeeze. Bethany recoiled in horror as salty drips rained down on James's face and tongue. Lauren screamed out and gave her brother a shove. James, stop that now! That's the grossest thing ever! Don't you want to drop then? James giggled as he flung the soggy shirt at his sister. Lauren dodged, and the shirt splattered harmlessly against the pavement, but she still closed up and gave her brother a brutal kick on the ankle. You're disgusting, she raged. We could go on a field trip to a sewer and you'd still lower the tone. James laughed as he picked up his t-shirt. That bruise on your back is so bad, James, Bethany said. James tried to get a look over his shoulder, but it was impossible without a mirror. I expect we've all got a few of them, he said. They rounded a corner into the square and were delighted to see 7 kids from various teams standing in front of a fold-out table covered in bottles of mineral water. James shoved his way between a couple of smaller kids and grabbed 2 bottles. He drank half of the first one and was pouring the remainder over his head when he spotted Kerry. She'd stripped off her boots, socks, and overalls. Her long black hair was soaking, and she had drips trickling down her face. They looked awkwardly at one another, unsure how to react after what had passed between them during the night. Kerry smiled a little. No hard feelings? James smiled back and gave her a quick kiss. Nah, course not. Have you heard about Kyle? Kerry asked. No, what? Took a hit in the neck. They had to take him to the hospital. These simulated rounds are bad ass, James said, shaking his head. Look at my back. Matches mine, Kerry said, lifting up her vest to reveal a giant red welt next to her belly button. You've got a couple of bad ones down your legs as well, James noted. So, Lauren interrupted, looking at Kerry. How many eggs has your team got left? Kerry's tone turned serious. She was always competitive, and there was the unpleasant prospect of a 10-kilometre punishment run hanging over their heads. All my team are back, she said dejectedly. We've only got 5 eggs between us. Lauren snapped her head towards James and grinned. I've got 2, Bethany's got 4, and Dana and Jake aren't even back yet. Kerry allowed herself to smile. I wouldn't hold out much hope on that score. Me and Gabrielle caught up with them. James couldn't help smiling. Who cares? He grinned. We've still got more eggs than you, Kerry. You'd better hope either Kyle's team or Team B have less than 5 eggs. Some of Kyle's team are over there, Lauren pointed. Kyle's out, but they've got at least 8 eggs. Kerry looked seriously troubled. I can run 10 kilometres easy, but how am I going to get my little red shirt through it? I'm sorry, James said solemnly. Kerry didn't seem to believe him. I bet you are, she tutted, as she swiveled on her bare feet and headed anxiously towards Gabrielle for an emergency conference. You can't blame me, James shouted after her, though he knew she would, because he'd broken her eggs. Lauren looked up at James. I wouldn't worry. You know how moody she gets. Yeah, James nodded, breaking into a relieved grin that he made sure Kerry couldn't see. I probably won't be getting my tongue in her mouth for a few days, but at least we've avoided the 10K run. Lauren backed away with a look of disgust. Ew! What an image! Your horrible gobby tongue. A few more kids had arrived at the water table, including Dana and Jake. But it was the arrival of Team B that caught everyone's attention. Whereas the other teams arrived in dribs and paint-splattered drabs, the Bs were all together. Their protective suits were unmarked, and they held their helmets under their arms, as if they were a NASA crew about to board the space shuttle. We were fighting all night long, James gasped. They're not even sweaty. Lauren raked her brains. I can't actually remember seeing any of that lot. They must have hidden out, while the rest of us massacred each other. God, they all look so smug, James said. I bet they haven't lost a single egg. And they almost hadn't. The instructors, Mr. Large and his assistants Pike and Greaves, arrived in 3 open-backed Land Rovers, blasting their horns and sending a shower of kids diving across the paved square. Large divided the teams up and began carefully inspecting every egg for the minutest sign of a crack. Though Kyle himself wasn't there, Team A scored 8. Mr. Large actually broke into a smile after he'd finished inspecting Team B. One slight crack means 29 out of 30 eggs. It's not often you brats impress me, but that is impressive. Team B was led by a 15-year-old girl called Clara Ward. She was in a couple of James's science classes, and he couldn't stand her because she was well behaved, always handed her homework in on time, and always got brilliant marks. Thank you very much, sir, Clara said, as she made James hate her even more by smiling at Mr. Large and saluting him. James made a gagging noise, then whispered in Lauren's ear, What a crawler. Cherubs don't salute. I know, Lauren whispered back. What does she think this is? The army? So how did you do it? Mr. Large asked. Clara smiled. Sir, I rode up here on my bike a couple of days ago and checked out the compound. I found 2 easy-to-defend buildings on the northeast side, next to the lake. They're only accessible via a narrow alleyway. We ran there as soon as the mission started and fortified our positions by moving some of the cars parked outside. The only resistance we encountered was one brief exchange of fire with a couple of members from Team D. Good work, Mr. Large said crisply as he moved on to Team C and stopped in front of Kerry. Oh, dearie, dearie dear, Mr. Large said when he saw the 5 eggs Kerry held out in a single polystyrene box. He took each egg out and carefully inspected it for cracks. 5 eggs, Large said solemnly. Extremely poor. Even in the unlikely event that another team does worse than you can still expect me to write a negative report on your leadership skills. Kerry looked miserable as Mr. Large strolled onwards with his 2 assistants in tow. James tried giving his girlfriend a sympathetic smile, but he couldn't catch her eye. So, Team D, led by the Addams family, Mr. Large said, allowing himself a dry laugh at his own little joke. 6 eggs, sir, James said, holding out the full box. James had checked the eggs for cracks less than 2 minutes earlier, but his heart still thumped as Mr. Large ran his eye over them. They're all okay, James said edgily. Mr. Large picked out the first of Lauren's 2 eggs. Whose eggs are these? Large snapped. Lauren stepped forward with a sense of dread. Sir? She said weakly. It has Lauren Addams written on these eggs, smirked Mr. Large. That is my name, Lauren said, too knackered to manage a sarcastic tone. No, it isn't, Large grinned. Your name is Puke. I'm not counting these eggs because they haven't got your correct name on them. 4 eggs for Team D. You finish last. James, Dana, Bethany and Lauren were all familiar with the sense of complete doom you get when Mr. Large nails you for no reason other than the sadistic pleasure it gives him. But Jake hadn't been through basic training and didn't know that answering back only made things worse. The youngster violently hurled his helmet at the ground. I'm not doing any run, Jake yelled furiously. This is a total stitch-up. Mr. Large swooped forward and grabbed Jake by his damp red t-shirt. He plucked the boy off the ground with one arm and screamed directly into his face. Do you want to pick a fight with me, Jake Parker? Jake looked so scared, James thought the poor kid was either going to faint or piss himself. When are you eligible for basic training? Large snarled. May next year, sir. 10 months shy of basic training. Not a good time to make an enemy of me then, is it? No, sir, Jake quaked. I make the rules here, Mr. Large shouted as he dropped Jake from 2 meters up. Don't any of you forget that. Jake crashed into the ground and tried his hardest not to sniffle as Bethany bent forward to help her little brother find his feet. 4 valid eggs for Team D, Large repeated. Team D gets the punishment run. James looked at Jake and Lauren's miserable faces and struggled to control his anger as Mr. Pike stepped into the fray. Come on, Norman, Pike said gently. You can't expect these kids to work hard and stay motivated when you pick out the loser before you even start. James was shocked. He'd worked with Pike on a couple of training exercises. Unlike Mr. Large, he always played fair, but this was the first time James had ever seen one of the junior instructors dare to question Large's authority. Large turned furiously towards his colleague. Mr. Pike, when you are the senior instructor, you can count the eggs. James felt emboldened by Pike's interference. He's right, he said, hardly able to believe that he was daring to backchat Mr. Large. I'm not going on any run until I've spoken to the chairman about this. You can't keep on having a go at Lauren. She's already served her punishment for hitting you. I'm giving you a direct order, Large screamed. And I'll obey the direct order as long as the chairman confirms it, James screamed back. I'm right with you, James, Dana said, stepping up beside him. Let's see the chairman. We can make a formal complaint about Lauren being bullied. Lauren and Bethany both murmured in agreement, and a noise went up from some of the kids in the other teams as well. If you go and see the chairman, you will all fail this exercise, Large shouted. James shrugged. So what? It's only an exercise. I've already passed basic training, and you don't have the authority to suspend us from missions. Drop it, Norman, Mr. Pike said. You're not going to win this one. Mr. Large turned around and looked at Kerry. All right, he sighed. Team C, 10 kilometres. Grab your packs. James turned to Dana and nodded. Cheers for backing me up. I'm going to see the chairman, Dana said. I know training's supposed to be tough, but the way he's bullying Lauren is totally out of order. Lauren looked at Dana and smiled guiltily. I'm sorry I called you cheesy earlier.